A white police officer broke the cane of an old blind black woman, in broad daylight, in front of everyone, and walked away as if it were nothing. Not in the movies. Not fake news. This happened for real, right in Fairview Park, the place people thought was the most peaceful place in town. The woman, Marjorie Hayes, did not scream, did not riot. She just stood there, trembling, holding the cane in two halves as if holding on to her crushed dignity. She was blind, she was weak, but she was not alone, because what the police officer did not know was that her son was a veteran police captain who would not let the silence last another day. And from that moment the resistance began, not with violence, but with truth and determination. This is not just a story about racism. This is a story that changed an entire town. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss a second of this journey to break the silence. There are places in the world where time seems to slow down. Elmridge, a small town nestled in the shade of ancient trees, is one of them. Here, dawn does not come quickly. Light quietly filters through the old wooden windows, painting soft yellow streaks on the cold floor left over from the night before. The early morning wind whispers something to the grass and trees, and the birds still keep their habit of singing softly, as if knowing that someone needs that sound to start a new day. In the small house at the end of Cedar Street, where leaves often rest on the steps like a silent greeting, Marjorie Hayes wakes long before the clock chimes. She is 74 years old, and her eyes have not seen the light since she turned 43, an event caused by irreversible retinal disease. But her world has never been dark. It has only shifted from images to sounds, scents, and memories. And it is in those things that she truly lives. She didn't need to see the sun to know it was a fine day. She could tell if it was cloudy or clear by listening to the wind blowing through the eaves or by the thin layer of frost on the window frame. The small kitchen was still warm with the scent of pine and herbal tea. On the old wooden shelf by the sink, the porcelain kettle hummed softly, the familiar sound she always used to tell the time. That morning, like many mornings before, she folded the pale blue silk scarf in half and draped it gently over her shoulders. The scarf her husband, Luther Hayes, had given her on her 40th birthday. He was a former history teacher, a quiet man who always used actions rather than words. When he died of cancer, she didn't cry much. She simply took the scarf he had tied around her wrist when he took her for a walk and began to put it on every morning as a way to continue the path he had walked with her. Her hand reached for the edge of the table, reaching for her cane. Not just any cane. The cane had an ivory handle, its head carved with a firebird spreading its wings, a symbol Luther had used in class to talk about hope and rebirth. The cane was his last gift, and for her it was his arm, his memory, his silent presence in every step. Fairview Park was where her husband had proposed, where they had sat on the oak bench to listen to the red-tailed sparrows sing in the spring. In the early morning, the park was empty, just the wind blowing, the leaves blowing, and the sound of water trickling under the wooden bridge. This was her world. No one was in a hurry. No pitying glances. Just freedom. Her cane tapped the gravel path, each beat like a gentle melody. When she reached the familiar old wooden chair, she put her hand on the seat, feeling the coolness of the wood, the small cracks like fingerprints of time. She sat down, exhaling slowly. A gentle breeze blew. She tilted her head a little higher, catching the breath on her cheek, as if Mr. Luther had just planted a kiss in the morning. "Good morning," she whispered, to no one, but everyone could hear. And then she fell silent, just listening to the world. You might ask, why bother with such detail? Why delve into such small habits, things that seem insignificant? But it is here, in the tap of her cane, in the way the 74-year-old blind woman made tea and found her way to the park by memory. that we understand what is at stake. This is not just a woman living alone. This is a woman rewriting the definition of autonomy. And so, when something terrible happens, it doesn't just shatter a peaceful morning, it shatters a delicate world that has been held together with quiet pride for decades. Marjorie Hayes still doesn't know. But a strange gaze, a heavy footfall, is coming toward the park, where she sits quietly as she does every morning. And after today, no morning will be the same again. Marjorie Hayes, 74, woke up early. Her eyes had not seen the light for nearly 31 years, since she last saw the face of her late husband, Luther Hayes, who had succumbed to a silent battle with bone cancer. When she reached the old iron gate of the park, the stick lay in her lap, her hands resting lightly on the handles, as if holding a living souvenir. The wind blew by, carrying the damp smell of rotting leaves and pine resin. She tilted her head, smiling, as if someone were kissing her forehead. "Good morning, Luther," she said softly, and did not wait for a reply. Perhaps no one heard. But she did not tell anyone else. It was enough for him to hear. But there was one thing she did not feel. A pair of eyes were watching her from afar. The gaze was not as soft as the morning wind. It was as heavy as a dark cloud about to pour down. A sound of shoes hitting the gravel, heavier than usual, not from someone exercising. It was not close enough for her to notice, but enough for someone else outside her peaceful scene to enter the stage. "Good morning," a voice said, short, gruff. There was no warm greeting, no softness in the tone. A man's voice, younger than her, but no longer young. And there was something in his voice that she could not mistake. The power on display. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked, a question that anyone who heard it would think was concerned. But Marjorie heard more than the sound. She heard the intention behind it. The tone was unlike the ones she met at the morning market, or the young man who made coffee every Sunday. It was not concern. It was an interrogation. She turned her head slightly toward the voice. The wind from the left wing brought a whiff of something. Leather, sweat, and polished rubber. A small detail she was used to. Uniforms. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking," she replied, calm, soft, but not lowering her voice. "Do you come here alone often?" he continued, this time more suspicious than curious. "I walk every morning. I know this park," she replied. A pause. No one answered, but the air seemed thicker. Then he said softly, but the last syllable was a cold razor. "You should be careful. This place isn't always safe." On paper, no one would have noticed the problem. But Marjorie heard it all. The way the word safe was emphasized, as if she, an old blind black woman, was doing something wrong just by existing in public. She pursed her lips, her hand still on her cane. There was no turmoil in her heart, no anger, no fear, just a kind of reflex, like the eagle's wings on her cane, ready to spread no matter how gray the sky. "Thank you for reminding me," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." And then she stood up. An old feeling rose. One she thought she had left behind since 1967, the time when she was the first young black teacher assigned to an all-white high school. That look, the one the officer had just given her, she was used to. It was a look not of surprise, but of denial. He didn't know her name. Didn't know she had lived in this town for nearly half a century. Didn't know she had won a national teaching award. He just saw a blind black woman alone and thought he should remind her. Pride was never about volume. It was about the way Marjorie kept walking, not looking back, not responding. But every step after that story, not as light as the first morning, because for the first time in a long time she felt the presence of worry. Not worry about herself, but worry about what people might do when they saw her vulnerable. She returned home, put her cane on the shelf, took off her towel, and sat down on the chair. The tea was cold, but she did not reheat it. She just quietly placed her hands on the wooden table, closed her eyes, and listened to the wind outside the window. A knock came from the subconscious, not the door, but the invisible door, where past and present meet. and outside something was waiting to enter. Not everyone hears what silence says, but Marjorie Hayes did. She was used to living in the dark. Not absolute darkness, but the soft shadow of a formless world where every perception was woven with sounds, scents, movements, and silences. That morning, as she sat on her usual bench under the old oak tree, she heard something unusual. Not birds, not wind, but something very human. Footsteps, and the contempt that came with them. Slow, heavy, uneven, the footsteps hit the gravel with a deliberate rhythm. Not those of a runner, not those of a walker, but those of someone who wanted to be recognized. Each step was a silent declaration. I'm coming, and I want you to know it. Marjorie tilted her head slightly, not to see. That had been gone from her 3 decades ago, but to hear better. The air around her seemed to freeze. The rustle of leaves receded. The familiar feeling was disturbed by a new presence. Heavy, uninviting. Good morning, the man's voice said, short, bare, and utterly devoid of warmth. Just 2 words, but the wind suddenly seemed colder. Not because of the weather, but because of the tone. A strange timbre, one that carried the superiority of authority without empathy. Hello? She replied, her voice soft, even, unshaken. She did not ask again. She did not invite conversation. But the other person did not leave. Are you all right, ma'am? A question wrapped in kindness, but inside was doubt, even disdain. She had lived long enough to recognize that tone, the kind of tone that people use when they ask out of duty, not out of concern. I'm fine. Thank you for asking, she said, still not looking toward the sound. The man was silent for a moment. Then he took another step, closer. Do you come here often? Another question. But not just a question, a search. She felt her spine straighten a little. Her hand on the end of her cane tightened. Not out of fear, but out of a reminder that she was right, that her presence in a public place on a peaceful morning did not require approval. I go for a walk every morning, she said simply. This park is familiar to me. Really? He said. And for a moment she heard the rustle of a sleeve against a belt, a faint metallic sound, enough to tell her that the man was wearing a police uniform. There was a long silence, but not the comfortable silence between 2 strangers. It was the waiting of someone who was assessing. Then finally, he said, in a tone that was as sharp as a pin, you should be careful. This park is not always safe, especially for someone like you. Someone like me? She repeated, her voice light as a breeze, but something in the tone froze the air. He did not answer, but silence was sometimes worse than words, and Marjorie Hayes understood. Someone like her. What did that mean? An older, black, blind woman, sitting alone in public? In the eyes of some, that was not an image of strength, but of vulnerability. She stood up, not in a hurry, not saying another word, just standing, cane in hand, head held high, back straight. Though she could not see his eyes, she felt them, eyes searching, trying to force her down with the unwelcome presence of power. She did not bend. Thank you for reminding me, she said, her voice still calm. Have a nice day. Then she turned away, her steps as steady as when she had arrived. But inside something in her had shifted. Not fear, for fear had long since ceased to be in her. It was the pain of a memory all too familiar, and now, after decades, after all the effort to survive, to get ahead, to maintain her dignity, she still had to hear it. One way or another. When she got home, she didn't change her clothes right away. She didn't make tea as usual. She just sat down in the chair by the window, her hand still on the top of her cane, and she knew, if someone touched it with contempt, they had touched something deep inside her. That afternoon, she got a call from her son, Captain Damian Hayes, who was working in another district. He called every week, always asking what she needed. But today, she just said, "Everything's fine, son." She didn't tell about the park, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she didn't know what had happened. It wasn't a clear action, There was no outright insult, no curse words, just a passing encounter, but a meeting that she couldn't shake from her mind because it was like a small crack in the wall. No one noticed until the whole house collapsed, and she felt it. Something was cracking, softly, but real. There are wounds that don't bleed. They don't ooze, they don't bruise, they don't need bandages, but they're buried deep in the heart, where no medicine can soothe them. And sometimes it starts with just a crack. The next morning, Marjorie Hayes woke up at the same time. But the tea was weaker than usual. Her hand slipped when she reached for the honey. Her scarf was tied a beat slower. No one saw it, but she knew. She went to the park anyway, not because she wanted to prove anything, but because if she didn't go, the other guy, the guy in the police uniform, would win. And Luther Hayes had never taught her to give way to those who used their power to instill fear. She walked more slowly, but each step was sure. Her cane touched the ground lightly, a rhythm no one else could replicate. Her cane touched cement, then brick, then the sparse gravel that led into Fairview Park. Everything was still in place, the bench, the trees, the birds, but she sensed something else, not with her ears, but with her skin. The air was thick with warning. As she neared the familiar bench, the footsteps came again. Not from far away this time, but very close. Too close. "Wow," said the familiar, dry voice behind her. "It's you again. A regular at the park." Her heart clenched. But she didn't turn around. She knew exactly who was standing there. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft and polite. "Not giving up, are you?" he said, his laugh clipped. "You must have guts." The air was heavier. "I'm taking my usual walk," she said, still clutching the end of her cane. "This is a public park, and I've been walking here for over 20 years. "Nice," he said softly, and took another step. She could hear the sound of his boots on the gravel. "But you know, for someone like you, that stick can do a lot of things." She turned, facing him for the first time, though she couldn't see him. Her chin lifted slightly, as if her eyes were still somewhere behind her lashes. "This stick isn't a weapon," she said. "It's my eyes." A long silence. Then suddenly, so suddenly, a jerk. Before she could react, the stick was torn from her hand as if it were an unclaimed object. "What are you doing?" she said, her voice choked. "Just testing the strength," he said. And then, crack! The sound of the stick snapping in two was like a thunderclap in broad daylight. Everything was silent. Even the birds stopped singing. Even the wind had died down. Mrs. Marjorie stood still. Her heart did not beat fast. It stopped, just for a moment, as if it wanted to stop with the sound. The stick. The thing she carried every day. The thing carved by her husband. The thing that held all the memories, all the falls and rises, now lay broken in two at her feet. The man, the policeman, stood before her, saying nothing more. He dropped the two pieces of the stick to the ground, as if he had broken off a dead branch that was no longer usable. "Next time," he said softly, his voice as smooth as grease, "be careful with your attitude. The stick will not keep you out of trouble." All around her, she heard people watching. There was a murmur, a pause in footsteps. Someone gasped, but no one spoke. No protest, no intervention, only the terrible silence of complicity. She knelt, not because she was weak, but because she needed to touch the stick before it was trodden on. Her fingers trembled for the first time in years. She touched the ivory tip, still engraved with the name L. Hayes. The remaining piece, jagged like a stab to her pride. He walked away. She heard no apology, no hurried, remorseful footsteps, only the crunch of gravel crushed by heels. The final sound of an indictment she was not allowed to write. She stood up. Her arms held the two pieces of stick. She did not cry. She did not scream. But something inside her had died that morning. She did not go home immediately. She walked slowly, very slowly, feeling her way with her bare hands. Every time she touched a familiar wall, her hand tightened on the broken stick. When she got home, she sat down on the chair, as usual. But this time, there was no tea, no radio playing classical music. There was only her and the broken stick lying on her lap, wrapped in a handkerchief like a body that needed to be covered. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in more than 30 years of blindness, she felt truly deprived of light. Some calls aren't stories. They're just a way for a mother to tell her son, "I'm fine." But sometimes it's the silence between words that makes a son turn around in the middle of the night. Damian Hayes, the Lakeview police captain, has never backed down from a case, but during that 130-mile drive in the pre-dawn light, his chest felt heavy in a way no investigation had ever felt before. His mother, Marjorie, had always been the toughest woman he knew, the one who sewed every one of his school shirts, the one who never complained even though her eyesight had left her when he was in high school, the one who walked with an ivory cane as if it were an extension of her dignity. And yet yesterday, during their regular phone call, when he asked, "Do you still walk this morning?" she replied, "Yes, but I'm a little more tired today." A little. It was that a little that made his heart ache. His mother never complained of being tired, not because she didn't know how to be tired, but because she didn't want her son to worry. And when she used that word, even gently, he knew. Something was wrong. Damian drove through the town of Elmridge in the pale light. The red brick roofs, the rows of yellow maple trees shedding their leaves, everything was still beautiful, still quiet, but too quiet, like the quiet before a big storm. He arrived at his mother's little house early. The door was unlocked. The house still smelled of old wood and herbal tea, but there was something in the air. Wrong. "Mother?" he called softly. There was no answer, just the rocking of the armchair. And then he saw her. She was sitting there, her head tilted, her arms holding something wrapped in a purple cloth. "Mother!" He walked quickly over, kneeling down, his hand on hers. "What's wrong?" Marjorie didn't answer right away. Her hands touched her son's face, grazing his jaw, his cheek, his forehead, as if to read him by touch, as she had done since he was a child. "You came again," she said softly as a breath. "Because I felt you needed me," Damian said. There was a long pause. Then she handed him the cloth, her hands shaking slightly. When Damian opened it, his heart clenched. The stick. It was broken in two. The ivory tip with the L. Hayes engraved on it was cracked. The wooden part broke diagonally, sharp as a slash. Damian said nothing. He just stared. "Who did this?" His voice was hoarse, but each word was as clear as a gunshot. "An officer," she said, as if it needed to be whispered to avoid hurting the air. "In the park. In the morning." Damian sat still. Not because he didn't believe it, but because he believed it too much. Because he had seen it happen before, on the quietest of street corners. But this time, it had hit his mother. "Did he have a name?" She shook her head. "I didn't ask. I didn't have time." A crack opened in Damian's heart. But instead of exploding with anger, it turned into a cold wave that rose inside him. So cold that he shivered not from fear, but from being too conscious. "Do you want me to do anything?" he asked, his voice as soft as an embrace. "Don't risk it," she whispered. "I know you. You're a fair man. But this town isn't fair to people like me. And people like you." Damian looked at her. Hair as white as morning dew, eyes as blind as ever, still shining with an inner light that could not be extinguished. "Mom," he said, holding her hand tightly, "I cannot do nothing. I am a police officer." "No," he shook his head. "Today I am your son first and foremost." Then he stood up, his face no longer that of a son, but that of a man carrying on his shoulders the past, the future, and a pain that could not be ignored in the name of the law. There are calls that are not stories. They are simply a mother's way of telling her son, "I'm fine." But for those who are used to reading between the lines, Silence is the gentlest cry for help. Damian Hayes is one of those people. When the phone rang last night, as usual, he called to check on his mother, Marjorie Hayes, the woman he thought was stronger than anyone else in the world. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little tired. It's windy today," she replied. A perfect answer for those unfamiliar. But for Damian, that "a little tired" rang like an alarm. His mother never said she was tired. Not because she didn't know how to be tired, but because she never let it be a burden to others, especially not him, her only child, the man in her life after her husband died. He didn't ask any more questions. He just said, "Get some rest, Mom." Then he hung up. But he couldn't sleep. He sat in the dark, staring at the empty space on his desk where a file was usually kept. But tonight, every case, every suspect, every report suddenly became meaningless. There was only one thing on his mind. Mom was not okay. The next morning, before the sun had even risen above the eastern trees, Damian left Lakeview. Headlights tore through the thin fog on Highway 6. His heart pounded as memories flooded back to him. The evenings his mother had spent sewing, the time she had taken him to church barehanded, because her cane was still being repaired, the times she had stumbled and fallen without shedding a tear. And now, the woman, for some reason, said she was tired. The small wooden house on the outskirts of Elmridge was as peaceful as ever. The lilacs were still blooming along the path. But the door was unlocked, and that did not reassure him. As he entered the house, he heard a faint whiff of classical music, Debussy's Clair de Lune, which his mother only played when she was in a bad mood. "Mother?" he called. No one answered. Then he saw her figure, sitting in an armchair, head tilted, holding something wrapped in a purple silk scarf. Damian stepped forward. Her feet, which had been treading on the conference room floor, crossing the social battlefield, seemed to collapse at the sight before her. Mrs. Marjorie did not raise her head. But when his hand touched hers, she squeezed it gently, as if she had known her son was coming. "Mother, what's wrong?" he asked hoarsely. No words. Only her hands trembled slightly, pushing the scarf towards him. Damian opened it, and his heart clenched. The stick. Broken in two, cold and deliberate. The ivory tip, where his father had hand-carved the name L. Hayes, was cracked. The wood was split diagonally, jagged like a pierced symbol. He didn't need to ask. The silence in the room wasn't calm. It was the silence of muffled pain. "Who?" he asked, his voice like metal on metal. "A policeman," she said. "In Fairview Park. This morning, when I was sitting like I always do." Damian stood up. But she reached out, grabbed his sleeve, and pulled him back. "Don't do anything stupid, son," she said. "You're a captain. They'll turn the story around. They always do." "Not this time," he said, his eyes blazing. "This time they've touched me. The one thing I can't keep quiet about." "You could lose a lot," she said softly. "And if you don't do anything, you'll lose yourself." Silence. Marjorie sighed. "I lived through the 60s. I was pushed off the bus for not sitting at the back. But I never thought, at this age, I'd still have to endure people treating me like an object in the way." Damian knelt down, resting his forehead on the back of her hand, just like he did when he was a child, when he was scared. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for not being there." "You don't have to apologize," she whispered. "You just don't let this go like it never happened." He nodded. His face was like stone. When he stood up, his eyes were no longer impulsive anger, but an oath. Not everyone understands that fighting the system does not begin with an explosion. It begins with a doorbell that no one answers, with averted eyes in the park, with hesitant, hasty words, "Sorry, I don't want to get involved." And Damian Hayes, who had led crime squads, who had faced armed killers, now had to relearn a different kind of fighting, where the weapon was the truth, but the enemy was a silence fed by fear. The next morning, while it was still dark, Damian left his mother's house. In his hands was not a gun, but 2 broken pieces of a stick, carefully wrapped in a purple silk scarf, undeniable living proof of nameless violence. He was not wearing a police uniform. Today, he needed to be seen as a son, not as a representative of the organization that his mother's attacker wore. Fairview Park was still crowded in the morning. Old people doing Tai Chi, children laughing, coffee carts already open. No one knew that this place had just been the scene of the most brazen invasion Damian had ever faced. Not with knives, guns, or blood, but with silent humiliation. He walked along the cobblestone path, his eyes scanning every face, every gaze. Then he saw the young man at the coffee counter. His eyes flashed with surprise as he approached. "Are you James?" Damian asked, his voice calm and even. The young man nodded. He wiped the thermos with his hand, as if trying to escape what was approaching. "I am Marjorie Hayes' son." James paused. "Is she okay?" he asked, his eyes darting around as if afraid someone might hear. "No, but she'll be better if I find out the truth." James swallowed. His hand tightened on the half-poured coffee. "I saw it," he said softly, almost in a whisper. I was standing right here when it happened." Damian didn't speak. He just opened the towel, showing James the stick. James stared at it for a long moment, then hissed through gritted teeth. "Holy shit. Can you film it?" Damian asked, looking straight ahead. James hesitated, then pulled his old phone from his back pocket, swiping it quickly. "I had a bad feeling, so I filmed it when I saw the officer approaching. And then, the video appeared. The image shook slightly, but it was clear." Marjorie sat still, looking peaceful. The officer approached, his hands behind his back. The sound was unclear, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, threatening. Then came the moment he pulled the stick, and the dry crack echoed in the daylight. Damian felt as if someone had just squeezed his heart. But he didn't show it. "Can you send me the clip?" James nodded quickly, his hands shaking as he sent the file. "When asked, tell the truth," Damian said. "No more, no less. Just tell me exactly what you saw. I'll take care of the rest." James nodded, as if a burden had been lifted. Damian left the counter, carrying nothing but the clip on his phone. But he knew. That was the first blow. He arrived at the Elmridge police station at noon. This had been a peaceful place, where he had interned as a student, where he had thought of the uniform as a badge of honor, not a cover for cowardice. But today all eyes were on him as if he were a traitor. "Hello, Captain Hayes," the officer on duty said, his voice strained. "I need to see the patrol logs for the past 2 days," Damian said, placing his badge on the table. The other man hesitated. "Is this related to something?" "Yes," Damian said. "A serious assault by one of your men." Finally, the officer on duty handed over the list. Damian scanned it, and was not surprised to see the name. Officer Nathan Kellerman. Single shift in the park area at the time of the incident. The name sent a chill down Damian's spine. He knew the man, not personally, but enough to know. An old officer who had been reported for inappropriate behavior, but had never been prosecuted for lack of evidence. Lack of evidence no longer. Damian printed out the entire file, then walked straight out of the station. He could hear whispers behind him with every step he took, but no one dared call him back. He knew they were preparing. The curtain was being drawn back. On the way back, Damian stopped at the park again. This time he passed a woman, pushing a stroller, walking slowly along the sidewalk. "Excuse me, do you have a minute?" he asked softly. The woman turned around, hair tied back, eyes cautious. "I'm Damian Hayes. The blind woman's son was assaulted in the park the other day." The woman's face fell. "I saw it. Not all of it, but enough. Are you willing to take a statement?" She hesitated. "I have a young child. I don't want to get involved." "I understand," he said, handing over his business card. "But if you're willing, you're not just helping my mother. You're protecting people like your child from growing up in a world where cruelty goes unpunished." She took the card, said nothing, but her eyes, for the first time, did not avoid. Not everyone who stands up carries a flag. Sometimes the resistance begins with a quiet step, carrying a bundle of broken sticks and a video file on a phone. Damian Hayes walked into the State Department of Internal Affairs headquarters at 8 o'clock a.m., Not as a captain, but as a son, representing a mother who had been publicly humiliated. There were no cameras, no loudspeakers, just a quiet hallway floor, pale gray walls, and 2 investigators waiting for him in conference room 214. One was Greer, a woman in her 40s with a piercing gaze. The other, Vasquez, gray-haired, short, quiet, but unblinking throughout the entire conversation. They invited him to sit. No handshake. No, "We're sorry about what happened to your mother." Just paper, pen, tape recorder, and a cold, procedural stare. "We got the video," Greer said. "It's very clear." Damian nodded, his hand still on the folder containing the patrol log, James's statement, and the second witness's information. The young mother named Clara, who had quietly slipped his card into her pocket yesterday. "I'm not here," he said slowly, "just to demand disciplinary action against Officer Nathan Kellerman. I'm here to make the point. If the humiliation and cane-pulling of a 76-year-old blind woman goes unpunished, then all of us in uniform lose what we once had." Vasquez nodded. Greer picked up the phone and called the personnel department. "Kellerman has been reported 3 times in the last 5 years, she said. Inappropriate behavior toward senior citizens, all ended without formal action. It can't end quietly now," Damian replied. "Are you willing to testify publicly?" Vasquez asked. "In what capacity?" Damian asked. "As an officer." Damian paused for a beat. "No, I will testify as a son, because the man in uniform did not attack a woman. He attacked my mother." Greer nodded. "We will open a formal disciplinary investigation. It will take time, and it will cause a backlash." "I understand." Damian stood up. "I don't expect justice to come quickly. I just want it to come before my mother's honor is deemed unimportant." But as Damian walked out of the Internal Affairs office, the coat of arms hung above the glass doors, he knew the battle had only just begun. And this time his opponent was not just a troubled officer. It was an entire system accustomed to covering up. 3 days later, the rumor spread like an oil slick through the Elmridge Police Department. Hayes filed a lawsuit against his own partner. "I heard he made a big deal out of getting yelled at by his mother. Who would dare to go on patrol like that?" Damian arrived at the station on Wednesday morning to find a piece of paper taped to his locker. Scrawled in black ink, it read, "Snitch for a mother, traitor for a son." He didn't tear it. He didn't react. He just quietly removed the paper, folded it, and stuffed it into his pocket, as if he were collecting more evidence. That afternoon, he discovered that the file he'd submitted had been temporarily lost in the system. He had to send it back. By afternoon, he'd received a false notification from dispatch, sending him to the wrong scene 10 kilometers away. It was all a technical error. Random. Coincidence. And it was all designed to wear down his patience. That evening, he arrived home later than usual. Marjorie was still there. A gray cardigan, her hair pulled back into a bun, a somber cello playing on the radio. "Is that you?" she called when she heard the door open. "Yes, Mom," Damian said softly. "How are you today?" "I'm fine," she said. "And you, are you okay?" Damian hesitated. He sat down in the chair opposite. His broad shoulders slumped a little. His face had aged several years in just a few days. "Everyone at the office avoided me," he confessed. "When I walked into the room, they stopped talking. When I asked for documents, they blamed the system. And Kellerman just walked around like nothing had happened." She nodded, softly, as if she had expected it. "You know," she said, "silence is a kind of scream. But not a scream of justice. A scream of fear." Damian looked at her. His eyes were red. "I'm just afraid I'm not strong enough," he said softly. "You know I am," she said. "I am Luther Hayes' son, and the fiancé of Justice." He smiled slightly. The smile of someone who had just taken a sip of cold water after days in the desert. "I want to go to the park tomorrow," she said. "Not to challenge anyone. Just to remind myself, I never lost my freedom." Damian nodded. "I'll go with you tomorrow." Damian didn't go to work that morning. He didn't wear his uniform. He didn't carry a gun. He only carried a long box, wrapped in dark blue paper and tied with a silver ribbon. His mother was sitting at the window, as she had every morning recently, listening to the radio, and so quiet it seemed as if she were talking to time itself. "Mother," Damian called softly. Marjorie turned her head, knowing instinctively that this was not the same day. "What have you brought?" Damian sat down beside her and opened the box. A new cane. Polished ebony. Straight and slender, but sturdy. The old ivory handle repurposed from a broken cane, inscribed in small silver letters, "To my strength." She said nothing. She just lifted her hand, shaking, tracing each line. She began, then stopped. "You don't have to say anything, Mother," Damian said softly. "I know." She smiled, a smile of joy and regret, like someone who had found something lost and irreplaceable. "You fixed the handle?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "I didn't," Damian said. "I kept it, as a memory, but the rest stronger." She nodded. A second later, she planted her cane on the floor. The clunk sound was soft but decisive, a prelude to something larger than themselves. "Where are we going, Mom?" "The park," she said. "I'll walk beside you," Damian said. "No, son," she corrected him gently. "You'll walk behind, to see that I can still walk." As they reached the gates of Fairview Park, the morning light filtered through the trees, drawing long shadows. The ground was still dewy, but the air was bustling. Old people walking, mothers leading their children, coffee carts steaming with smoke. And then they appeared. Mrs. Marjorie, in a gray cardigan, a purple silk scarf draped over her shoulders, her new cane touching the ground with a steady step. Damian followed a step behind, empty-handed, head straight. They walked along the path, not speaking, not stopping, but all eyes were on them. Some paused. A few old people took off their hats. A young person put his hand to his heart. No one said anything, but reverence hung in the air like static electricity. A little boy let go of his mother's hand and ran to her. "Miss, were you the one the ugly policeman took his cane from?" She bent down, touched the boy's head, and smiled. "Yes, but now you have a new cane. Are you feeling better?" "You were never weak," she replied softly and walked on. When they reached this old oak bench where it had all begun, someone had placed a bouquet of white flowers there. A small card was pinned to it. "We see, and we are no longer silent." She sat down. For the first time in weeks, she raised her head to the sun. "See, Damian?" she said. "The light is still here, no matter how much people try to cover it up." He sat beside her, saying nothing. His hand gently squeezed the new cane, as if to give strength to the man who had fought the world with his spine and his heart. Within an hour, the video that James had taken that day, along with today's photos, began to circulate on local social media. No headlines, no calls for help, just truth and return. And so the new battle began. No longer just Damian and his mothers, but the town's. Some storms don't blow away houses. They just blow away the dust that covers the truth. 3 weeks after this hearing, the town of Fairview no longer looks the same. Not because a new street opened, or a new factory opened, but because people started to look at each other differently. An 80-year-old woman wrote in the local newspaper, "I kept quiet when the officer told my husband he was impeding traffic because he was old and weak. But when I saw Marjorie Hayes walk away without apologizing to anyone, I knew it was time for me to speak up." A freshman recorded a video about Marjorie, calling her Grandma Grit, and it got more than 500,000 views in a week. Flyers were everywhere. Coffee shops, libraries, post offices, with a picture of a stick and the words, "No one should be broken." And on the old bench under the oak tree where it all began, a new bronze plaque was quietly installed, without fanfare. It read just one line, "For those who never stopped walking, MH." No one knew who had placed it, but everyone knew it was in the right place. That Sunday morning, Marjorie Hayes, in a silver-gray cardigan, a purple silk scarf, and a new wooden cane with an old ivory handle, appeared at the gates of Fairview Park. Without an appointment, dozens of people stood silently along the path. They did not shout slogans, did not wear badges, just glances and nods. A blind man led his son to her. A young brown woman held her 3-year-old daughter, and stood still, her hands clasped. Damian walked behind his mother. No uniform, no phone. He just walked silently, like an unarmed bodyguard. And Marjorie, she didn't need anyone to guide her. She knew the way. By memory. By every muscle. By years of turning pain into a map. When they reached the old wooden bench, now a sacred place of silence and dignity, Marjorie sat down. Damian sat beside her. No one spoke, only the sound of falling oak leaves. The next morning, Fairview felt different. Not in a loud, celebratory way, but in the still, reverent hush that follows a storm finally passing. People walked slower. Some smiled at strangers. And in the hallway of Fairview High, the walls didn't carry whispers of shame or suspicion. Just quiet. A kind of quiet that said, something had shifted. Marjorie sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The old rocking chair creaked beneath her, its familiar rhythm syncing with her breathing. She watched a neighbor's child rollerblade down the sidewalk, arms out, wobbling like a bird trying to fly for the first time. She smiled. Freedom always looked a little clumsy in the beginning. There were still bruises on her skin, some deep under the surface. But the real marks, the ones that mattered, were the ones she had left behind. Not scars. Traces. Like the paper under the bench, like the name on the reform bill, like the way that little girl held her stuffed bear tighter and stood taller after hearing the words, "I was tested, but I didn't break." Marjorie got up and walked inside, slowly, steadily. The cane wasn't there anymore. She could walk without it now. But sometimes she reached for it, not for balance, but remembrance. Damian came home early that day. He dropped his keys in the bowl by the door and found his mother standing in the kitchen, staring at a photo on the fridge. It was one he had taken years ago, of her at the local library, arms crossed, half smiling as if daring the world to challenge her knowledge. "Still got that look," he teased. She chuckled softly. "Only when necessary." Damian leaned against the counter. "You ready for that speech tomorrow?" "I'm not sure it's a speech," she said. "More like a conversation. I don't want to stand behind a podium. I want to sit in a circle, face to face." He nodded. "Good. They need to hear it that way." That night, Marjorie sat at her desk and wrote down nothing. She had opened her notebook, clicked her pen, and then closed both again. Because she realized her story didn't need drafting. It needed living. The next morning, the high school auditorium was packed. Seniors fidgeted in their seats, some skeptical, others just tired. A few teachers lined the back wall. One of them whispered to another, "I heard she's the one who stood up to Officer Trent." The other nodded. And didn't stay down. Marjorie didn't enter with any fanfare. She walked in quietly, carrying a small box under one arm. A chair had been placed at the center of the stage, but she didn't take it. She stood in front of it instead. "I was invited here," she began. "Not because I'm a hero, but because I didn't let one moment define me." Some students leaned forward. "I brought something with me." She opened the box and took out what looked like an old piece of wood, smooth, broken at one end. "This," she held it up, "used to be my cane. It broke the night I was thrown down. I kept a part of it, not as a symbol of weakness, but of memory. Because pain without memory leads to silence, and silence lets things fester." The room was still, not even a cough. "You don't have to stand in front of cameras to make change," she said. "You don't need to shout in protest, unless shouting is the only way they hear you. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that whispers and doesn't waver." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Weren't you afraid?" Marjorie nodded. "Terrified. But I realized fear isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that something matters to you, that you care." And caring, in a world that often tells you not to, is a kind of rebellion. By the time she sat down, even the skeptical ones clapped. A few stood. One teacher wiped away a tear and muttered, "They'll remember this more than any lesson I've ever given." That evening, Damian returned to the park. Not for answers, but because something in him needed to return to that bench one more time. The note was still there. He smiled. But now, beside it, someone had left a second note. Different handwriting, a simple message. "I heard the cane. I'm listening now." He didn't know who wrote it. Maybe a stranger, maybe someone in uniform, and that was the point. Change was happening, not in boardrooms or on headlines, but in benches. Notes, whispers, quiet ripples, becoming waves. As he walked home, he passed the mayor's office. The new plaque was already installed by the front door. The Marjorie Hayes Initiative: Justice Through Compassion. Respect through story. Damian paused to read it again. This time, he didn't tear up. He just breathed deeply, like a man who had finally exhaled after holding in too much for too long. Back home, Marjorie was waiting on the porch. He sat beside her. For a while, neither of them said a word. Then she reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a folded letter. "It's from the department," she said. "They want me to help design the new training curriculum." Damian blinked. "You're gonna do it?" She smiled. "I already started." It begins with this sentence: "Don't aim to control a room. Aim to understand the people in it." He looked at her, proud. "That's yours?" "That's ours," she said. "Every step we took to get here." The world didn't change overnight. Some still rolled their eyes when her name was mentioned. Others quietly backed away from the program. But enough stayed. Enough signed up. Enough cared. And that was how things began. Not with the crash of thunder, but with the steady sound of footsteps. Tapping. Remembering. Moving forward. Not just surviving, but living. An awakening. Here's a 500-word outro, written in a style that's outrageous, inspiring, and actionable, just as you'd expect. It serves as a final emotional punch, leaving your audience both thoughtful and on edge, and leading them to engage with your channel in a natural way. So there. A blind black woman is humiliated in broad daylight, not because she did anything wrong, but because she dared to exist in a place where a white person didn't think she deserved it. No guns, no batons, just a broken stick, enough to turn one person's self-esteem into fear for an entire community. And the most outrageous thing? The silence. The silence of those who walk by and don't stop. The silence of those who know the truth, but choose to keep their heads down for fear of offending someone in power. And the silence of an entire system. Until one son decided, "I will not let my mother be a symbol of fear. She must be a symbol of resistance." But you know what was more painful than that officer's actions? To see a mother, 76 years old, blind, come home with 2 pieces of a stick in her hand, no longer believing that this world has room for kindness. This story is not a triumph. It is a warning that we cannot expect justice to come from a uniform. We must build it from eyes that do not close and hearts that do not accept indifference. If you are reading this, ask yourself, have you ever seen injustice? Have you ever seen someone treated as if they were invisible? And what did you do? Because the truth is, silence is also a choice. And sometimes that's the cruelest choice. Don't let another mother fumble through the darkness of humiliation. Don't let another child fight alone to regain the minimum respect for their parents. If you believe Marjorie Hayes deserves respect, hit that like button now. If you're outraged, leave a comment to give her and Damian strength. And if you don't want to miss out on real, powerful stories like this, hit subscribe. Because every like, every subscribe, is a commitment. We won't close our eyes. We won't turn away. and we won't let this kind of thing slip away. Thank you for sticking around until the end. And if this story breaks your heart, remember, you're not alone. And your silence, or your voice, can change a life.